In late August 1944, a column of German troops launched a desperate counterattack near the French town of Chartres. They'd pushed through abandoned American positions, expecting to find the usual spoils of war, perhaps some ammunition, maybe rations left behind in the chaos of retreat. What they discovered instead would fundamentally alter their understanding of the war they were fighting. Inside a captured American supply depot, German officers found something that shouldn't have been there. Fresh chocolate cake. Not field rations, not hardtack or preserved meat, an actual birthday cake, baked in Iowa just 6 days earlier, shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, transported through the port of Cherbourg, and delivered 400 miles inland to a forward supply point, all while still fresh enough to eat. One of the German officers, a logistics specialist who'd spent years managing the Wehrmacht's increasingly desperate supply situation, later wrote in his diary, "At that moment, I knew we had already lost the war. They were bringing cake to the front lines while we couldn't get bullets to ours." But this wasn't just about cake. What German commanders were witnessing represented the single greatest logistical achievement in military history, an operation so vast, so impossibly efficient that it defied everything they understood about warfare. The Americans weren't just winning battles. They'd created a logistics machine that could deliver 12,500 tons of supplies per day, using nothing but trucks on a roadway system that shouldn't have been able to handle it. Question German generals kept asking. How could an army move faster using trucks than the Wehrmacht could using railroads? How could Americans deliver ammunition to the front lines faster than German trains could deliver it to depots 50 miles behind their own positions? To understand how this happened, we need to go back to where it all began, to the fundamental difference in how Germany and America understood modern warfare. When World War II began in September 1939, the German Wehrmacht possessed what many military analysts considered the most modern, mechanized army in the world. Newsreels showed endless columns of panzer tanks rolling through Poland, France, and later the Soviet Union. The Blitzkrieg war became synonymous with Germany's technological superiority. But here's what those newsreels didn't show. Behind every panzer division, stretching back for miles, came the horses. The German army entered World War II with 514,000 horses. Over the course of the war, they would employ 2.75 million horses and mules. A single German infantry division required 4,842 horses to move its supplies. The famous panzer divisions that symbolized German military might. They could advance rapidly for short distances, but their supply lines crawled at the speed of a horse-drawn wagon, roughly 15 miles per day, if the weather was good. German logistics officers knew this was a problem. They'd known since 1940. But Germany's entire transportation infrastructure was built around railroads. They'd inherited the most advanced rail network in Europe from the previous century, and their entire military doctrine assumed that conquering territory meant capturing enemy railroads and converting them to German gauge. It had worked in France. It had even worked initially in Russia. But by 1944, that doctrine was failing, catastrophic ally. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American military planners were designing something completely different. They weren't looking at horses or trains. They were looking at trucks, specifically. An unglamorous vehicle that would become the unsung hero of the Allied victory. The GMCC KW, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 572,500 of these 2.5-ton cargo trucks. For context, Germany produced approximately 70,000 Opel Blitz trucks, their primary military cargo vehicle during the entire war. The United States produced over 8 times that number of just one model. Total American truck production reached 2.4 million military vehicles. Did you know that in 1941, the United States manufactured more than 3 million civilian cars? When America entered the war, those same factories didn't just slow down, they completely converted to military production. By 1943, only 139 civilian cars were produced in the entire country. Everything else was tanks, trucks, and aircraft. But it wasn't just about numbers. The GMCC CKW represented a fundamental philosophical difference. German trucks like the Opel Blitz were precision-engineered vehicles designed for efficiency. American trucks were designed for something else entirely. They were designed to be simple enough that a teenager with 3 weeks of training could maintain one in a muddy field in France, using basic hand tools. German officers who examined, captured, American trucks were shocked by what they considered crude construction, simplified manufacturing techniques, stamped metal parts instead of precision-forged components. They saw it as evidence of inferior engineering. What they failed to understand was that this wasn't a flaw, was the entire point. An American truck could be mass-produced in incredible numbers, repaired in the field with minimal tools, and kept running by crews with minimal training. A German truck might have been more refined, but when it broke down, it needed a specialist, special parts, and time three things the Wehrmacht didn't have by 1944. This philosophical difference would manifest in the most dramatic logistics operation of the war. But before we get to that, we need to understand what happened on June 6, 1944 on, the crisis that followed. The Allied invasion of Normandy succeeded beyond initial expectations. By late July 1944, American forces had broken out of the Normandy hedgerows and began racing across France toward Germany. General George S. Patton's Third Army was advancing so rapidly that even American commanders were stunned. On August 1st, Third Army was at Le Mans. By August 15th, they'd reached Orleans. By August 25th, they were approaching the German border, having advanced over 400 miles in less than a month. This was unprecedented. Patton's armored divisions were moving faster than German forces had during the invasion of France 4 years earlier. But there was a massive problem. Supplies. Every army division required approximately 700 tons of supplies per day: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies. Patton's Third Army had multiple divisions racing across France. The math was brutal. They needed roughly 30,000 tons of supplies delivered every week, and they were moving farther from their supply bases every single day. The Allied plan had assumed they'd capture French ports and use them to bring supplies close to the front lines. But Hitler had ordered German garrisons to defend every port to the last man. Cherbourg was in Allied hands, but it had been so thoroughly destroyed that its capacity was severely limited. The massive port facilities at Antwerp wouldn't be operational until November. Marseille was hundreds of miles away in the wrong direction. Everything, every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every ration had to come through the Normandy beaches, travel hundreds of miles across France, and reach rapidly advancing armies. It was a logistical nightmare. And then, on August 25th, American supply officers calculated that Patton's Third Army would run completely out of fuel within 4 days. The fastest advancing army in military history was about to grind to a complete halt within 7 miles of the German border. This is the moment where the American military did something that German logistics officers would later describe as impossible. On August 25, 1944, the U.S. Army activated Operation Red Ball Express. The name came from American railroad terminology. Red Ball referred to express trains that had absolute priority. The idea was simple: create a one-way circular highway system entirely dedicated to rushing supplies from the Normandy coast to forward supply depots near the front lines, then back again. The execution was anything but simple. The Red Ball Express would eventually involve approximately 23,000 soldiers, roughly 75% of them African-American service members who'd been relegated to logistics roles because the U.S. Army was still shamefully segregated. These drivers would operate 5,958 trucks at the operation's peak, running day and night. In convoys that stretched from horizon to horizon, the rules were strict. Trucks traveled in convoy, 50 yards apart, at speeds up to 45 miles per hour on roads designed for 30. One lane was designated for fully loaded trucks heading east toward the front. The other lane was for empty trucks returning west. No civilian traffic was permitted. Military police stationed every few miles ensured that nothing, not retreating forces, not other supply columns, not even generals, staff cars interfered with the Red Ball convoys. The scale was staggering. Picture this. At any given moment, 900 trucks were on the road. A single convoy could stretch for 20 miles. They operated 24 hours a day. Drivers worked shifts of up to 20 hours straight, surviving on Benzedrine tablets and coffee, sleeping only when their trucks were being loaded or unloaded. The danger was real. German snipers occasionally fired on convoys. Luftwaffe fighters, though increasingly rare, sometimes strafed the roads. 5-to-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets posed constant threats. Trucks carrying ammunition were particularly vulnerable. One hit could trigger a secondary explosion that destroyed dozens of vehicles. But the biggest enemy wasn't German weapons, it was physics. These trucks weren't designed for sustained high-speed operation. Engines overheated, tires burst, brake drums cracked from constant use. Drivers sometimes fell asleep at the wheel after 20 hours of continuous operation, crashing into ditches or vehicles ahead of them. And yet, somehow, it worked. On August 29, 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day, their highest total. Between August 25th and November 16th, when the operation officially ended, Red Ball drivers delivered 412,193 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment to Allied forces. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire monthly ammunition production in late 1944 was approximately 300,000 tons. The Red Ball Express delivered more ammunition in 3 months than Germany produced in that same period, and that's just counting what traveled through this one supply route. German intelligence officers monitoring American radio communications couldn't believe what they were hearing. Reports described supply columns that defied military logic. A captured Wehrmacht logistics manual from 1944 noted, American motorized supply capacity appears to exceed doctrine by several orders of magnitude. Verification required. But the verification came from their own frontline troops. German units conducting counterattacks kept encountering the same impossible reality. Abandoned. American positions that should have been desperate for supplies instead contained fresh bread, hot coffee, and yes, occasionally fresh cake. Did you know that American field kitchens were delivering hot meals to frontline troops almost every day? Not cold rations. Actual cooked food, beef stew, fried chicken, even hamburgers and hot dogs when supply lines permitted. German soldiers, who often went days eating only hard bread and whatever they could scavenge, found this incomprehensible. One German prisoner of war, a junior officer captured near Metz in September 1944, was interrogated by American intelligence. When asked about German morale, he said something revealing. The soldiers are still willing to fight. But when they capture an American position and find that your troops eat better in one day than we eat in a week, they understand what we're up against. You're not fighting a war, you're just waiting for us to realize we can't win. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. The Red Ball Express, as impressive as it was, shouldn't have been possible. And German analysts knew it. In October 1944, Wehrmacht intelligence officers got their hands on captured American supply documents. What they found seemed like a mistake. According to their calculations, the tonnage the Americans claimed to be delivering daily exceeded the theoretical maximum capacity of the road network by 40%. The numbers literally didn't make sense. A German logistics officer, Oberst Colonel Werner Müller, wrote in a report dated October 18, 1944, either the captured documents are deliberate disinformation, or the Americans have discovered methods of transportation that violate known principles of logistics management. We cannot replicate their supply efficiency even when our rail lines are intact and operating normally. They achieve superior results using trucks on damaged roads. The Americans hadn't violated any principles. They'd simply approached the problem from an entirely different direction. German logistics doctrine, inherited from railroad-era thinking. Optimized for efficiency, calculating precise load capacities, scheduling rest periods, maintaining equipment according to detailed manuals. American doctrine, optimized for volume and speed. If a truck broke down, abandon it and continue with the convoy. If the engine overheated, pour water on it and keep driving. If a driver was too exhausted to continue safely, pull over, let the next driver take over, and catch a ride back on an empty truck. If brake drums were glowing red from constant use, keep going until they literally fail, then replace the whole truck. It was brutal. It was wasteful by German standards, and it worked spectacularly because the Americans had something Germany didn't: seemingly infinite industrial capacity to replace losses. For every truck that broke down, there were 10 more waiting to replace it. But trucks alone weren't the secret. The real innovation was something German commanders barely noticed until it was too late. On August 31, 1944, George Patton's Third Army ran out of fuel near the Moselle River, just outside Metz. They were only 70 miles from the German border. The advance came to a complete halt. Patton, famous for his aggressive leadership and colorful profanity, reportedly told General Eisenhower, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have gotta have gas." The Red Ball Express was already operating at maximum capacity. There simply wasn't enough fuel coming through Normandy to supply both Patton's Third Army and field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's British forces advancing to the north. Eisenhower made a controversial decision: prioritize Montgomery's advance toward Antwerp. Patton's army would have to wait. For 3 days, Third Army sat stationary. Patton's staff calculated that they had enough fuel reserves for perhaps one more major assault before completely exhausting their supplies. German forces, recognizing the lull, began reinforcing defensive positions around Metz. The window for a rapid advance into Germany was closing. And then, on September 3rd, the fuel arrived. Not just enough to resume operations, enough to launch a full offensive. What changed? The Red Ball Express had found every available truck in the European theater. Vehicles that had been designated for other purposes were even some trucks assigned to British forces were temporarily borrowed. Over 1,000 additional trucks joined the convoys. But beyond raw numbers, American logistics officers had done something remarkable. They'd improved efficiency. Cargo handlers developed new loading techniques that reduced turnaround time at supply depots from 4 hours to 90 minutes. Drivers learned to identify shortcuts and optimize routes. Military police directed traffic to prevent bottlenecks. Maintenance crews positioned themselves along the route, conducting repairs without requiring trucks to leave the convoy. The system was evolving and becoming more efficient through practical experience rather than theoretical planning. This was something German military doctrine, with its emphasis on precise planning and procedure, couldn't replicate. The Wehrmacht was brilliant at preparing detailed operational plans, but when those plans encountered unexpected reality, adaptation was slow. American forces, by contrast, had cultural advantages that manifested in logistics. The Red Ball Express drivers included former truck drivers, mechanics, and even a surprising number of men who'd worked in American automotive factories before the war. They understood trucks not as military equipment requiring special expertise, but as tools they'd been working with their entire lives. Sergeant Bill Wells, a Red Ball Express driver from Detroit who'd worked on the Ford assembly line before enlisting, later recalled, "We weren't doing anything special. We were just driving trucks, same as we'd done stateside, except longer shifts and people were shooting at us sometimes. The loads were heavier. The roads were worse, but a truck's a truck. You keep it moving until it stops. Then you fix it or get a new one." That attitude treat trucks as disposable, replaceable tools rather than valuable equipment requiring careful maintenance. Horrified German logistics officers who examined captured American transportation plans. From their perspective, it was wasteful and unsustainable. What they failed to recognize was that American industry could sustain that wastefulness almost indefinitely. By October 1944, German intelligence had assembled a comprehensive picture of American logistics capabilities, and what they discovered was deeply disturbing. A German intelligence report compiled from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and field observations concluded, the United States has effectively created an entirely new form of mechanized warfare. Not mechanized, combat mechanized logistics. Their doctrine prioritizes rapid supply delivery over supply conservation. This allows their combat forces to operate at tempos we cannot match, even under ideal conditions. The report continued with a damning comparison. A single American Army Corps receives more fuel and ammunition weekly than an entire German Army group. This is not due to wastefulness, but rather reflects genuine demand. Their forces expend ammunition at rates we would consider criminally profligate. They compensate through supply volume we cannot interdict. But perhaps most tellingly, the report noted, American forces routinely abandon functional equipment when it becomes inconvenient to transport. We have recovered trucks, artillery pieces, and even tanks left behind simply because supply priorities required transport capacity for other materials. This behavior is incomprehensible under German logistical doctrine, but apparently standard practice for American forces. What German analysts were documenting was the fundamental advantage of America's industrial capacity. Germany had entered the war with a military designed for short, decisive campaigns. When the war extended beyond those initial expectations, German industry struggled to adapt. By 1944, Germany was producing approximately 347,000 military trucks total accumulated over the entire war. The United States produced 2.4 million. Did you know that the U.S. delivered 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union under Lenin? That's more trucks than Germany produced for its own military during the entire war, and America sent them to one ally while simultaneously supplying multiple other fronts. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov later acknowledged, "Without American trucks, we would have lost the war." But trucks were just one piece. American industry provided almost two-thirds of all Allied military equipment. Produced during the war, 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and those 2.4 million trucks. Germany produced approximately 90,000 aircraft, 73,000 artillery pieces, and 67,000 tanks during the same period. German soldiers discovered this reality not through intelligence reports, but through direct experience. A German lieutenant, captured during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, was being held at a POW collection point near Liege, Belgium. American guards provided him and other prisoners with breakfast, fresh eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, and orange juice. He later wrote in his memoir, "I realized at that moment that we had been fighting an enemy that could afford to feed prisoners better than our army fed its frontline troops." The guard mentioned that the eggs had come from the United States, eggs shipped across an ocean to feed prisoners, while our soldiers were eating ersatz bread made from sawdust and whatever we could confiscate from occupied territories. This realization spread through POW camps across Western Europe. German prisoners were initially suspicious. They assumed American rations must be propaganda designed to demoralize them. But the sheer consistency of American logistics gradually convinced them otherwise. This wasn't a special effort to impress prisoners. This was just how American forces operated. A German logistics officer, Major Klaus Reinhardt, captured in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, was interviewed by American intelligence officers. They wanted information about German supply lines. Instead, Reinhardt spent most of the interview asking questions about American logistics. He wanted to understand how it was possible. The interrogation report records his statement. "I have been a logistics officer for 6 years. I helped plan supply operations for the French campaign and later for Army Group Center in Russia. I thought I understood military logistics, but what you've accomplished defies everything I studied. You're moving supplies at speeds that should require railroad networks, but you're doing it with trucks on roads that shouldn't support that traffic. How?" The American interrogator reportedly didn't have a satisfying answer. The truth was that even American officers didn't fully understand why their logistics system worked so well. They'd designed it through trial and error, practical experience, and a willingness to discard traditional doctrine when reality proved it inadequate. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ended operations. The port of Antwerp had finally opened, providing supply facilities much closer to the front lines. The emergency that necessitated the Express had passed, but its impact had fundamentally changed modern warfare. In those 83 days of operation, Red Ball trucks and drivers had delivered approximately 412,000 tons of supplies across an average distance of 350 miles. More impressively, they demonstrated that trucks could match or exceed railroad efficiency under specific conditions, particularly when traditional infrastructure was unavailable or damaged. The statistics tell only part of the story. The deeper impact was psychological. German military planners had built their entire strategic doctrine around the assumption that logistics required railroad networks. When those railroads were destroyed or simply unavailable, German forces became effectively immobile. American forces, by contrast, could operate anywhere trucks could drive, which meant almost anywhere. This flexibility manifested in unexpected ways. When German forces launched the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, they caught Allied forces by surprise and made significant initial gains. But German commanders had planned the offensive around a critical assumption. They would capture American fuel depots in the first 48 hours. Using American gasoline to fuel German tanks for the rest of the operation, it almost worked. German forces came within miles of major fuel depots, but American logistics officers, recognizing the danger, began evacuating supplies faster than German forces could advance. Trucks that had been delivering supplies to forward positions suddenly reversed direction, hauling fuel stocks backward to prevent capture. This adaptive flexibility, the ability to rapidly reverse supply flows and redirect resources, was something German logistics couldn't match. Their horse-drawn supply wagons and railroad-dependent system required careful planning and couldn't respond quickly to unexpected developments. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945, German forces had advanced as far as fuel allowed, then literally ran out of gas. They abandoned hundreds of tanks and vehicles simply because there was no fuel to move them. American forces, despite initial losses, never faced supply shortages. The trucks kept running. What happened to the men who made this possible? The Red Ball Express drivers, despite their crucial role, received little recognition at the time, because most were African American and the U.S. Army was segregated. Their contributions were often overlooked in official histories. Some returned home to face continued discrimination. Despite having served in one of the war's most dangerous logistics operations, Sergeant Bill Wells, the former Ford worker from Detroit we mentioned earlier, returned home in 1946. He applied for jobs at several automotive companies, leveraging his military driving experience. One interviewer told him, "We're not hiring colored drivers." Wells eventually found work at a small trucking company in Michigan. He never received recognition for his Red Ball service until a 1983 ceremony honoring African American veterans. But the historical impact couldn't be erased. The Red Ball Express proved that modern mechanized warfare was as much about logistics as combat. The U.S. military internalized this lesson. Every American military operation since World War II has prioritized logistics, planning, and supply capacity. German prisoners of war, particularly officers, struggled to reconcile their experiences with their pre-war understanding of military superiority. Many had been taught that German organizational skills and engineering excellence made their military the finest in the world, encountering American logistics which often seemed crude and wasteful by German standards yet worked more effectively than German systems, caused genuine cognitive dissonance. A post-war survey of German posts conducted by American military intelligence asked what surprised them most about the American military. The most common answer wasn't combat tactics or weapons technology, it was logistics. Multiple respondents mentioned being shocked by American supply abundance and efficiency. One particular quote stood out. A former Wehrmacht colonel wrote, "We spent years studying warfare strategy, tactics, troop movements. The Americans studied production, transportation, and supply management. We prepared to win battles. They prepared to win the war. These are not the same thing." By 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the contrast between American and German logistics had become stark. American forces operated with supply chains stretching back hundreds of miles, yet functioned better than German forces defending their own homeland with theoretically short supply lines. The difference: American trucks could bring supplies anywhere. German logistics, still dependent on railroads that Allied bombing had systematically destroyed, collapsed. By April 1945, entire German army groups were immobilized, not by combat losses, but by sheer inability to move supplies forward. The The numbers tell the final story. American forces in Europe consumed approximately 18 million tons of supplies between D-Day and V-Day. Germany's total ammunition production for the same period was less than 3 million tons. The disparity was so vast that it barely qualified as a competition. The story of how German officers couldn't believe American trucks could deliver ammunition faster than trains is really a story about two different philosophies of warfare colliding. Germany approached World War II as an industrial-age power, applying 19th-century logistics doctrine with 20th-century weapons. Their strategy assumed that superior tactics, better-trained soldiers, and technological advantages in weapon systems would win battles. And for the first few years, this approach worked brilliantly. America approached World War II as an industrial superpower that understood something fundamental. Modern warfare is ultimately about production and supply. It doesn't matter how superior your weapons are if you can't deliver enough of them to the battlefield. It doesn't matter how well-trained your soldiers are if they run out of ammunition. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a logistics operation. It was proof that unglamorous, practical solutions like mass-produced trucks and willing improvisation could outperform elegant engineering and careful planning when applied at sufficient scale. German trucks might have been better vehicles individually, but there were fewer of them, they were harder to repair, and German doctrine couldn't adapt to use them as effectively. This lesson echoes far beyond World War II. Every modern military understands that. Logistics determines what's possible in combat. The most sophisticated weapons are useless if they can't be supplied, maintained, and deployed where needed. America's current military dominance rests less on superior weapons. Many adversaries have comparable technology and more on unmatched logistics capability. But there's a human element that shouldn't be forgotten. The Red Ball Express succeeded because 23,000 soldiers, most of them African American men facing discrimination even within their own military, drove trucks 20 hours a day for 83 days straight. They did it knowing they'd receive little recognition. They did it because the mission required it, and because their fellow soldiers depended on them. When German officers examined American supply operations and concluded we cannot replicate this, they were partly right. They couldn't replicate American industrial capacity. But more fundamentally, they failed to recognize that effective logistics requires trusting, practical-minded people to solve problems creatively, rather than demanding rigid adherence to procedures. The chocolate cake found by German soldiers near Chartres wasn't just a curiosity. It represented a military that could deliver non-essential morale items across an ocean and hundreds of miles of war-torn countryside as a matter of routine. That capability, more than any weapon or tactic, sealed Germany's fate. In the end, the Germans had been right when they said they were fighting the future with machines from the past, but they'd misunderstood what that meant. It wasn't about tanks or aircraft. It was about logistics systems designed for industrial-scale modern warfare versus logistics inherited from the railroad era. The outcome was never really in doubt. The Germans just hadn't realized it yet when they found that cake.